So I've recently updated my mastering chain to include a couple of new effects, and I think I've now got the perfect balance between colour, utility and compression, and I'm super happy with all of my mastering results. So I'm going to break down each step of the chain while talking about a couple of tips and tricks that you can help improve your mastering. And I'll mention some alternatives as well as I go through, but I'm going to be using the best VSTs that I personally could find for this process. So I'd love to know in the comments down below what your go-to mastering effects are at the minute. Is there anything unusual, or are you using hardware, or are there any interesting sort of hardware modeled effects that you're using? Would love to know in the comments down below. Plus I've also got a sample pack giveaway in this video as well, so stay tuned for that. But before I jump into the actual mastering process, there's a couple of pre-master checks that I would usually do. So the first thing to do before thinking about mastering is to take a critical listen of the track. So if you've mixed the track and produced the track, it might be worth taking a break if you can, at least a night to sleep on it if possible. It's not always possible, but having fresh ears really helps identify some of these smaller issues. Or if you're mastering for someone else, go in and take a listen and make sure they've not missed anything. So it could be pops or unusual artifacts, or maybe just the bounce of the mix isn't quite right in some way. So make sure you identify that quickly and then potentially adjust it yourself if you're mixing it, send it back to the mixing engineer to fix before you master. And it's also good at this time to take notes of the overall impression of the track. Is it too boomy or muddy? Or does it need more warmth in any areas? Try and jot that down now, and then you can address that while you're mastering. It's also worth at this stage, especially if you're new to mastering, trying to find some reference tracks of what you're actually going for. It can be really difficult in isolation to figure out what's wrong with the track sometimes, especially if you've listened to it 100 times. You sort of get numb to some of the issues with the track. So try and find a reference track, and I'll show you in a second the best way to sort of A/B compare. And of course, there are a lot of issues such as phasing or unwanted noise that really you want to get rid of before mastering. So potentially if you're the mastering engineer, you might want to highlight a few of these and send it back before actually working on the track. But yeah, with that said, let's dive into the master. So this is the track I'm going to master. It's called Unforeseen Blunder, which I wrote for chess.com for a recent tournament. It's sort of jazzy hip hop track. And as part of the compilation, it was also mastered by a mastering engineer. So I'm going to use that as the A/B reference. If I solo, I can swap between. I can hear that the master's a little bit airier, a little bit brighter, and a bit tighter in the low end. Sort of try and emulate all that in my master. You can see I've dropped the volume to try and get a sort of like for like comparison. Obviously it's going to be louder because it's mastered. And then as I master the track later on, I can up the volume of this just for a sort of a comparison again of loudness and stuff like that. Make sure that you're going to the external out on the reference, otherwise it's going to go through the master chain, which you don't want. You want a clear comparison. So going over to the master chain, I've got Insight 2 on the end, which is a sort of analysis VST. It's not doing anything to the audio. It means that I can look at the loudness, look at the spectrum and the stereo field and stuff like that. And I can throw that on the reference as well and do the same and just see how it fares in terms of the overall EQ profile. Obviously it's the same track, so it's going to be quite similar. But if you're using a different track for reference, then you can see where they both lie on the spectrum. So the first thing I do is throw on utility, which is bass mono mode. So essentially anything below 80 Hertz is going to be monoed. You can push this higher as well. And it's sort of genre and track dependent. But for the most part, if you want a tight low end, you want the bass to be hitting from both speakers at the same time. So you want to make sure that you've got a nice mono bass. We'll push that a little bit more for this case. And then the second step is an EQ 8, which is doing a similar sort of thing. So again, this is the default settings that I usually turn on. You can tweak it more, but this is what I usually have by default. So again, I've got mid-side mode and I'm cutting the sides. So it's already mono below 80, but we're sloping it as well just to reduce some of the width as we get up to 100 as well by default. And then I've also got on stereo mode, I'm cutting frequencies below around 30 Hertz because you can't really hear them anyway. So in this genre, it's not important and it may interfere with some of the compression and stuff later on. So these are just default settings that I'll do to start off a track. Next up, I've got another EQ 8, which is more for surgical EQing. So especially if I've not got access to the actual mix and I'm mastering a track for someone else, then this can be super important. Whereas if I can go back to the mix and get rid of frequencies there, I will. But even so, what you can do with the EQ8 is take one of these bands, increase the Q to reduce the sort of frequency spectrum, and then go on to the listening mode. And you can slide through and find any frequencies that could be problematic. And then you can drop the gain and just cut them a little bit. So we'll just go and cut out a few sections. So I've gone in and chopped out some of the more problematic frequencies. So it's quite subtle, but when you start to increase the loudness and compress it more, these issues become a lot more present as well. So it's worth getting them out of the way now and make sure they don't interfere with any of the later processes. But quickly before I finish off breaking down my mastering chain, I've got a quick message from this week's video sponsor, who is Skillshare. For those of you who haven't heard of Skillshare, it is the biggest online community for creatives to learn and grow, with classes in a range of topics from videography, music production, musical instruments, and all aspects of creative arts are covered. For me personally, I've always struggled finding time to learn and grow, so I've been setting a target to spend at least half an hour each day. I've got a little timer that I can monitor it, and spend at least half an hour each day going over some different classes and courses. There's so much great content on there by, firstly, these huge YouTubers who are just, experts in the field of YouTube content creation, or looking for more guitar-based topics. There's loads of great guitar players doing courses on all sorts of genres. And again, whatever you're looking for, be it mastering or mixing, if you have a search for it, then there's going to be some great topics on there. So you've got these learning paths, which are fantastic. So they're sort of curated courses. So this one, for example, is 4 different classes covering 3 hours on how you can improve your music production in FL Studio. And there's also a range of classes from different industry leading experts in the fields. So it's always great to go on, see how many students have already taken the class, and you can have a little look at the summary. So if you click the link in the description down below, the first 500 people to do that will get 1 month free of Skillshare, where you can explore to your heart's content all of the content available on Skillshare for free and decide whether it's for you or not. And it's just a great way of checking it out and seeing if there's anything that you could find interesting. Plus, for anyone who's already a member or who signs up through the link in the description down below, if you go over to your profile, take a screenshot and send it to my email, wonderloops@gmail.com, and then I'll be giving everyone who does that $15 credits to my sample pack store, put towards some new presets, some new samples, or some new merch. So be sure to do that if you're interested. Link in the description down below. Onto the rest of the next up, the final EQ in the sort of first stage EQing section. And this one is the Ozone 11 EQ. Now, I use this one mostly for sort of more broad adjustments. If I want it to be a bit brighter, produce the sort of low end, whatever it may be. And it's also great for adding a bit of color, although my main sort of color processes come a little bit later on. But what I will do is open it up. I'm going to do a little bit of a high shelf here, just to give it a little bit more brightness above like the 4K mark, just subtle amounts. And then if there's any particular sort of sections I want to cut out, say it was a bit muddy, maybe 200 to 500 hertz frequency, I can sort of adjust a little bit. You can isolate here and just have a listen. So I like the warmth there. A little bit muddy maybe around here, so we'll just drop the frequency slightly. And you can do that as much as you need. Again, I sort of want to get a bell here just to drop this little bass resonance a little bit. So just subtle amounts, and then as I say, you can add some color with the analog mode, or you can keep it flatter with the digital mode. So we'll keep it flatter for now as we add color later on. So that's the end of the sort of stage 1 EQing. So next up is a little bit of a controversial one, but I use Soothe 2 often on the masters. Now, ideally you'd use Soothe earlier in the mixing process to tame any of the resonance in different instruments on a sort of track by track basis, maybe as a sort of for some of the sort of groupings. But it can be a nice way to tame some frequencies in the master as well. If used subtly, if you use it too much, it can destroy the master and it can be a bit too extreme. But used subtly in the soft mode, it can be a nice way to tame some resonance. So usually maybe tame some of the low end, some of the little subs and the bass frequencies. Maybe the snare's a little bit too sharp. And you can try and keep this above the -3 as a general rule of thumb on this scale. Potentially as well, taming some of the sort of sharper high frequencies, so end up duplicates, and then use a different instance for that. So here I'd want to make sure I'm removing any of the soothe from the low end, so I'm just focusing on the higher frequencies and getting rid of some of the sharpness, so you can hit the headphone here just to listen to what you're doing. Increase the depth so we get a little bit of reduction, a little bit more selective, and a little bit sharper. So you can hear some of the more unpleasant sort of frequencies that you're getting rid of here. So that just soothes it out a little bit on the top end. And then we've also got another sort of dynamic EQ, but one that's really more honed in on mastering. So Gullfoss is a great tool for sort of like adaptive EQ, again like soothe, but less specific, more broad. So if you want to get a general brightness or maybe tame some of the low end without getting too specific, this is a great way of doing it. Maybe you want a little bit less brightness, tame it a little bit, cover a bit, and you can tweak these to taste and try and sort of assess the reference as you're doing it. So it's sounding pretty good, and we've tamed a lot of the frequencies, adjust the banding a little bit. We're getting quite a smooth sound already. So next up, we're going to add a bit of color and a bit of sort of stereo width. So here we have the ozone exciter, which adds a little bit of saturation, a little bit of compression to certain frequencies. And you can do that in mid-side mode as well to sort of accentuate some of the stereo information, which I love to do with this accent stereo effects preset. So this is in the side mode, and you can see it's doing quite a bit of saturation to really pop out some of the stereo information. And it's only going to work on stuff that's already there, so it accentuates what's already there rather than sort of like widening it on the master, which we'll do a little bit in a bit if needed. And you've got the mid mode, which is giving a bit of saturation here as well. And also what you can do with the mid mode is give a bit of saturation to the low end. This is everything below about 350 hertz. You can make it a little bit warmer, make it pop more. So essentially, this is what you're doing. Let's go for a bit of tube saturation. So that's at 100% high amount. We're going to drop that right down, so it's a little bit more subtle. Maybe bring the mix down a little bit. Just add a little bit more warmth. And this is a great tool for adding that warm saturation. And you've got different models, retro, analog, tape, tube, etc. So yeah, really good plugin. And you can add additional bands if you want to get more sort of specific. But generally, as a rule of thumb, I like to accent the stereo effects, add a little bit of warmth to the bass. Next up, I may not always use this again, but Ozone 11 Imager. If you want to add a bit more stereo width, this is a great way of doing it. And you can hone in on different sections and see if there's enough width. So generally, the higher frequencies are where you're going to want to add this width, if any. We can spread this out a little bit. Maybe spread it out a little bit here as well. So far, if we turn everything off, you'll be able to hear difference. So we're making it much brighter, cleaner, and a little bit of width and saturation. So next up, we start to get onto some of the compression. So I like to use a glue compressor from Ableton to help glue it all together. There's different, more expensive options as well. Generally here, I'm just looking to give it a few dB of fast attack, fast release, sort of gentle compression, just to make sure we tame the kick a little bit. It's on 50% dry wet. You can up that if needed. Keep it about there for now. It's a couple dB of compression, and I'm not adding any makeup at this stage. Next up, I've got a sort of analog model compressor. This one is from Arturia, and this one is the Comp FET76. And this is for a sort of, again, more gluing, more character. This is a slower, softer sort of compression. So we're going to increase the input until we start to get a little bit of gentle compression here. A little bit too much there. I want it to be like around a dB or two. Just helping glue it together. This one, I'm going for a slightly slower attack and release. Just gently taming the track. And again, adding a little bit more of the sort of analog flair. Next up, we've got one more EQ. So this one is EQ Citral 295. This one is, again, from Arturia. And what I'm using this for is some last minute adjustments and some gentle presence. So what I mean by that is, on the visualizer, this is just a sort of band EQ. So if it's a bit too bright at this point, I can adjust that. So roll some of that off. If I want to increase some of the mids, I can pick the frequency band and boost. And again for the lows. So again, as it's based on analog gear, we're getting that character. You've got the original and the alternative mode as well, which is a different sort of analog flair. And it all adds towards the final sort of texture and character of the track, as well as last minute EQ adjustments. Now, finally, onto the last stage, which is loudness. So for this, it really depends on the genre, what you're mastering it for, and sort of your desired results. So Spotify would recommend -14 LUFS as the average volume and a peak of -1 dB true peak. Spotify does also recommend if you're going to go above -14 LUFS, then you can drop the true peak down to -2 dB to give them a bit of headroom. But if you're unsure, what I would recommend doing is going to Spotify and making sure you're listening to the audio as it was delivered. And you can actually route that into your DAW, into your Insight 2, and have a look at what the levels are. That's one way of doing it. For me, I'm going to go for probably about -0.3 on the true peak and around -14 LUFS on the average volume loudness. So first thing I do though is I use the Ozone 11 vintage limiter. And what I'm doing here is I'm just pushing a little bit of gain in, and I'm going to try and adjust the volume so it's not blowing your head off. But I add a bit of gain through this, but without getting any compression. If you drop it down, you're going to get some compression. I don't want any compression from this limiter. I just want to add a bit of, again, analog tube limiting gain. You can go between tube and analog for different flavors, or modern for a cleaner, more transparent flavor. Usually I stick with tube. And then onto the final stage, which is the maximizer, and that's where I'm going in. So I want -14, and I want a output level of probably 0.3 on the negative on the true peak, and then you can learn it here just to make sure you're getting the right level. And then generally what I'll do is once I've done this, I will make any final tweaks. Sometimes once you've done the compression, you start to notice some issues that you didn't before. So go in, do any final tweaks, and then I'll just let the track play through on Insight and take some notes if there are any that I want to change, and just see what it's coming up with for the loudness levels. So do let me know in the comments down below what your go-to mastering plugins are. But do let me know in the comments down below if you've got any questions. A lot of these effects could make a video on their own. There's so many sort of variables to it. But this is just my general go-through workflow and process. But yeah, thanks for watching, and catch you next time.